This is a story I never thought I'd share. It's raw, it's painful, and it's something I've carried in silence for too long. My name is Angelica Matthews. I'm a 45-year-old single mother. And this is the story of how my life spiraled into a place I never imagined, a place I never wanted to be. It all started with my son, Harry Schneider. He's 18 now, but in my mind, he's still that little boy who used to cling to my leg. Afraid of the dark, I raised him on my own after my divorce from his father, Samuel Henson. It wasn't easy, but I did my best. Harry was my world, my everything. But something changed. It's exhausting, but I do it because I want to provide for my son. Harry, he's my world, my everything. But being a single mother comes with its own set of challenges. I've been on my own since my divorce from Samuel Henson, Jay's father. 5 years ago. Samuel was complicated. He wasn't a bad man, but he wasn't present. He was always busy with work, always distracted. I felt invisible in my own marriage, like I didn't matter. After the divorce, I threw myself into raising Harry. He was only 13 at the time, and I wanted to make sure he felt loved and supported. But somewhere along the way, I lost myself. I stopped dating. I stopped going out with friends. My life became about work. And Harry, that's it, I won't lie. It's been lonely. There are nights when I sit in my living room staring at the TV, but not really watching it. I think about how quiet the house is, how empty it feels. I miss having someone to talk to, someone who sees me not just as a mother or a nurse, but as a woman. But I've always told myself, it's worth it. Harry is worth it. He's a good kid, smart, funny and kind at least he used to be over the past year. I've noticed changes in him. He's become more withdrawn, more secretive. And then there are the moments when he looks at me in a way that makes my skin crawl. I don't know how to explain it. It's not like he's done anything wrong exactly. But there's a tension between us now. A tension I don't understand, and it scares me. I love my son, I really do. But sometimes I feel like I'm drowning in his needs. His emotions, his obsession, that's the word I've been avoiding. But it's the truth. Harry has become obsessed with me, and I don't know how to handle it. I've tried to brush it off, tell myself it's just a phase. He's young. He's confused. He's figuring things out. But deep down, I know it's more than that. And I don't know what to do. I feel like I'm failing him, failing myself, and I'm so tired. This is who I am, a woman trying to hold it all together. A mother who loves her son more than anything but feels like she's losing control, and a person who's just lonely, so very lonely. Now let me tell you about Samuel Henson, my ex-husband, Jam's father. Samuel is complicated. He's not a bad man. I want to make that clear. He's not the villain in the story, but he's not the hero either. He's just human flawed, like the rest of us. When we first met, I thought he was everything I wanted. Ambitious, driven, successful. He was a businessman, always working, always striving for more. And at first I admired that about him. I thought his dedication was inspiring, but over time I realized that this ambition came at a cost. Our marriage became an afterthought. He was always busy, always distracted. I'd try to talk to him to connect, but he'd brush me off. Not now. Angelica? He'd say, I've got work to do. It wasn't just the long hours. It was the emotional distance, the way he'd come home and sit in front of the TV, barely saying a word. The way he'd forget our anniversary or my birthday, or even simple things like asking how my day was. I felt invisible, like I didn't matter. And it hurt more than I ever let on when Jameer was born. I thought things might change. I thought Samuel would step up, be the father. I knew he could be. And for a while he did. He'd come home early to spend time with Jameer. He'd play with him, read to him, tuck him into bed. But as Jameer grew older, Samuel's attention shifted back to work. He became distant again, not just with me, but with two. And that's when I knew our marriage was over. The divorce was hard, not because I still loved him, I didn't, but because I didn't want Jameer to grow up without a father. I didn't want him to feel the way I did. Unimportant. Unseen. Samuel is still in Jerry's life, but barely. He calls on birthdays and holidays. He shows up to the occasional school event, but he's not present. Not really. And as for me, we barely speak. When we do, it's polite surface level. Like two strangers who happen to share a past. I don't hate him. I don't even resent him anymore. But I do. Wonder, sometimes, what if he'd been different? What if he'd tried harder? Would things have turned out differently, I guess? We'll never know. Sam is a part of mystery, a part of Harry's story, but he's not the focus, not anymore. That's the thing about life. People come and go, and sometimes Theonies who are supposed to stay don't. And then there's Harry, my son, my baby, the person I love more than anything in this world. Jameer is 18 now. But in my mind, he's still that little boy who used to crawl into my bed during thunderstorms. The one who'd hold my hand so tightly when we crossed the street, as if he was the one, protecting me. He's always been my shadow, my constant companion. But things changed. After the divorce, I think it hit him harder than I realized. He was only 13 at the time, and he didn't fully understand what was happening. All he knew was that his dad wasn't around as much, and I think that broke something in him. Harry became more attached to me at first, I thought. It was sweet. He'd want to spend all his time with me, asking me to watch movies or play games. He'd tell me everything about school, his friends, his dreams. I was a safe space, his rock. But as he got older, that attachment started to feel different. He'd get jealous if I talked to other men. He'd sulk if I spent too much time at work. And then there were the looks, the way he'd stare at me sometimes, like he was trying to figure me out, like he was seeing me in a way he never had. Before, I told myself it was just a phase. He's a teenager after all, hormones, emotions, all of that. But deep down, I knew it was more than that. Jameer was confused, lost, and I didn't know how to help him. He's always been a good kid, smart, funny, and kind. But over the past year, I've seen a side of him that scares me. He's become more secretive, more intense. And then there are the moments when he says things that feel off, things that make me uncomfortable. I've tried to talk to him to understand what's going on in his head, but he shuts me out. He'll give me one answers or change the subject. And when I push too hard, he gets angry. I know he's struggling. I know he's trying to figure out who he is, but I also know that his feelings for me have crossed a line. I never thought we'd have to worry about Jameer sees me as his only constant source of love, and in a way I understand that after the divorce, it was just the two of us. We became a team, a unit. But now that closeness feels dangerous. I love my son, I really do. But I'm scared of what he's feeling, scared of what he might do, and scared that I've failed him. In some way, this isn't how it was supposed to be. I wanted to give him a happy, stable life, but instead I feel like I've created a mess. I don't know how to fix. Harry is my son, my heart, but he's also Al, a young man trying to navigate a world that doesn't make sense to him, and I don't know how to help him without losing myself in the process. Let me take you back to a specific moment, a moment that looking back feels like a turning point. It was a regular evening, nothing special, just another day in our lives. But it's one. I can't forget we were having dinner, Harry and I. It was one of those rare nights when I wasn't working late and he wasn't held up in his room. I'd made his favorite spaghetti with garlic bread. I thought it would be nice a chance for us to talk to, connect. But from the moment we sat down, I could feel the tension. Jameer was quiet to quiet. He kept his eyes on his plate, pushing the food around with his fork. It tried to start a conversation. "How was school today?" I asked. He shrugged. "Fine, anything. Interesting happened." "Not really." I tried again. "How's your friend?" "What's his name, Rowan?" "He's okay." It was like pulling teeth. Every question I asked. He answered with one or two words. No details. No enthusiasm, just nothing. I felt a pain of frustration and sadness. This wasn't the Harry. I knew the Harry who used to tell me everything, who'd come home from school bursting with stories about his day. I reached across the table, touching his hand. "Jameer, are you okay? You seem distant." He pulled his hand. "Away, I'm fine, Mom," but he wasn't fine. I could see it in his eyes, the way he avoided looking at me. The way his jaw tightened when I pressed him. I didn't know what to do, so I let it go. We finished dinner in silence. The only sound, the clinking of our forks against the plates afterward. I cleaned up while Harry went to his room. I stood at the sink washing dishes, and I felt this overwhelming sense of failure, like I was losing him, and I didn't know how to stop it. Later that night, I found myself scrolling through old photos on my phone, pictures of me and Samuel from before everything fell. There was one in particular that caught my eye. It was from our wedding day. We were smiling, laughing, looking at each other like we were the only two people in the world. I stared at that photo for a long time, wondering where it all went wrong, wondering if things could have been different. But the truth is, I don't know. All I know is that the man in that photo isn't the same man who walked out of my life 5 years ago, and the boy sitting at my dinner table isn't the same little boy who used to crawl into my bed at night. Everything's changed, and I don't know how to fix it. That dinner, those photos, they're just small pieces of a much bigger picture, but they're pieces that haunt me because they remind me of what we've lost and what we're still losing. Let me take you further back to a time when things were simpler, happier, or at least they seemed that way. Or wedding day, Samuel and I. It was a small ceremony, just close family and friends. I remember the way he looked at me when I walked down the aisle, like I was the most beautiful thing he'd ever seen, like he couldn't believe I was his. We danced that night under the stars with the sound of the ocean in the background. He held me close, whispering promises in my ear. Promises of forever, of always. I believed him. I really did for a while. It felt like we were unstoppable, like nothing could tear us apart. But life has a way of testing event. The strongest bonds and ours didn't hold fast forward a few years. Harry was born. He was this tiny, perfect little human who completely changed my world. I remember the first time Samuel held him, the way his face lit up with pride for a moment. It felt like we were a real family. But that moment didn't. Last Samuel's work trips became more frequent. He'd be gone for days, sometimes weeks at a time, and when he was home, he was distracted, distant. Harry didn't understand. He was just a little boy, and all he knew was that his dad wasn't there. I'd find him clinging to me after Samuel left, his little face pressed against my chest. "When's Daddy coming back?" he'd ask. I didn't know what to tell him, so I'd hold him tight and say, "Soon, baby, soon." But soon didn't mean much to a child. And as the years went by, Jameer stopped asking. He stopped waiting. Now, here we are years later, and everything's different. I feel so isolated, so unappreciated. I pour everything I have into being a good mother, a good provider, but it never feels like enough. And Harry, he's struggling. I see it in the way he carries himself, the way he lashes out at me, then apologizes with tears in his eyes. He's trying to figure out who he is, where he fits in this world. But somewhere along the way, his emotions got tangled up, twisted, and now he's crossing lines. I never thought we'd have to worry about it. Started small, a lingering hug, a comment that felt too personal. I told myself it was nothing, that he was just confused. But then it escalated, the way he'd look at me, the way he'd touch me. It wasn't normal, and I didn't know how to stop it. I've tried to talk to him to set boundaries. But every time I do, he shuts down, or worse, he gets angry. I feel like I'm failing him, failing myself, and I don't know how to fix it. Those memories of our wedding day, of Harry as a little boy, they're like ghosts. Now reminders of what we once had and what we've lost. But the present is messy, complicated, and I don't know how to navigate it. It's hard to pinpoint the exact moment things started to shift, but if I had to choose, I'd say it was that night, the night we shared a bottle of wine. It was a Friday evening. I'd had a long week at work, and Harry had been quieter than usual. I thought it would be nice to unwind together, to connect, so I opened a bottle of red wine and poured us each a glass at first. It felt normal, comfortable. We sat on the couch talking about nothing in particular. Jameer seemed more relaxed than he had in weeks. He even laughed at one of my jokes, a real genuine laugh. It was nice, but as the wine flowed, something changed. Jameer started to get bolder. He'd lean in closer. When he talked, his breath warm against my cheek. He'd touch my arm when he laughed, his hand lingering a little too long. I told myself it was nothing, that he was just tipsy. But deep down, I knew it was more than that. Then he said something that made my stomach drop. "You're really beautiful, Mom," he said. His voice soft but intense. I froze. I didn't know how to respond. So, I laughed it off. "Oh, stop it," I said, trying to sound casual, but he didn't. "Stop." He kept looking at me, his eyes dark and unreadable, I mean it. He said, "You're the most beautiful woman I've ever seen." I didn't know what to say, so I changed the subject, but the tension in the room was thick, uncomfortable. After that night, things started to escalate. Harry began making subtle advances. He'd hugged me longer than usual, his arms tied around me. He'd compliment me in ways that felt off. "You look amazing in that dress," he'd say. "War, you smell really good." I tried to brush it off, to tell myself it was just a phase, but it was getting harder to ignore. Then there were the stares. I'd catch him looking at me sometimes, not the way a son looks at his mother, but the way a man looks at a woman. It made my skin crawl, but every time I confronted him, he'd deny it. I wasn't staring, he'd say, "You're imagining things," but I wasn't imagining it. And then there were the changes in his behavior. Harry started wearing cologne around the house. He'd dress up even when we weren't going anywhere. He'd style his hair, put on his best clothes, and walk around, like he was trying to impress someone I didn't know what to do. I felt trapped, torn between my love for my son and the growing onus in my gut. I kept telling myself it would pass, that he'd grow out of it. But deep down, I knew it wasn't that simple. The tension between us was building. And I didn't know how much longer I could ignore it that night. With the wine, the lingering touches, the stares, they were all warning signs. But I didn't see them. Or maybe I didn't want to. Either way, I couldn't stop what was coming. It all came to a head on a night. I'll never forget a night I wish I could erase from my memory, but I can't. We'd been drinking, again another bottle of wine, another attempt to feel normal, to feel connected, but this time it was different. This time, the alcohol didn't just lower our inhibitions, it shattered them. I remember feeling lightheaded as I got ready for bed. My nightgown clung to me, soft and familiar, but I felt exposed, vulnerable. I climbed into bed, the room spinning slightly, and closed my eyes. That's when I heard it. The creak of my door opening. I didn't need to look to know it was him. Harry. He didn't say anything, just stood there in the dark. His presence heavy in the room. I could feel his eyes on me, even though I couldn't see them. Then he moved slowly, quietly. He approached the bed. I held my breath, my heart pounding in my chest. The first touch was gentle, almost hesitant. His hand brushed against my arms, ending a shiver down my spine. I didn't move. I didn't know what to do. But then his touch grew bolder. His hand slid down my arm over my hip, and I felt a wave of panic. I reached out gently, touching his hand, hoping he'd stop. He didn't. Instead, his touch became more insistent, more urgent. His hands moved over me, exploring, claiming, and I felt frozen, paralyzed. My mind raised flashbacks of my life with Samuel, flooded my thoughts, the way he used to hold me, the way he used to love me. But those memories were tainted now, broken. And then there was Harry, my son, the little boy I'd held in my arms, the one I'd promised to protect. Theon. I loved more than anything in this world. But this wasn't love. This was something else. Something dark and twisted. I wanted to stop him, to push him away. But I couldn't. I felt trapped, torn between my love for him and the horror of what was happening, the act itself. I can't bring myself to describe it, not in detail. It's too painful, too shameful. But I can tell you this. It wasn't just physical. It was emotional, devastating. When it was over, I lay there staring at the ceiling, my mind a whirlwind of guilt and confusion. How had this happened? How had I let it get this far? Harry didn't say a word. He just left the room, closing the door behind him, and I was alone. With my thoughts, my regrets, my shame. I felt like I'd betrayed everything I believed in my role as a mother. My love for my son, myself that night, changed everything. And there was no going back that night. Those touches, that moment, they haunt me. Every single day. And I don't know if I'll ever be able to forgive myself the morning after. I don't even know how to describe it. It was like waking up in a nightmare, one I couldn't escape. I opened my eyes, and for a moment I thought it had all been a bad dream. But then it hit me. The memories, the shame, the guilt. It was real, all of it. I lay there staring at the ceiling, my body heavy with dread. I didn't want to move. I didn't want to face the day, but I had to. I got up slowly, my leg shaky, and made my way to the bathroom. I avoided looking in the mirror. I couldn't bear to see myself when I finally left my room. I found Jameer in the kitchen. He was sitting at the table staring at his hands. He looked up when I walked in. And for a split second, our eyes met. The look on his face. It was a mix of guilt, confusion, and something else I couldn't quite place. Shame. Maybe regret. I didn't know what to say, so I didn't say anything. I just grabbed a cup of coffee and left the room. The days that followed were a blur. I went to work, but I couldn't focus. My mind kept drifting, back to that night, the way his hands felt on me, the way I'd frozen, the way I'd let it happen. I'd be in the middle of a conversation with a colleague, and suddenly I'd hear his voice in my head. "You're really beautiful." Mom, I'd be charting a patient vitals, and I'd feel his touch on my skin. It was like I was trapped in a loop, reliving that night over and over again. And Harry, he was different too. He started skipping meals. I'd make dinner, but he'd stay in his room claiming he wasn't hungry. He started staying out late, coming home long after I'd gone to bed. I wanted to talk to him, to ask him what he was thinking, what he was feeling. But every time I tried, he'd shut me out. "I'm fine," he'd say. But he wasn't fine. And neither was I. Then came the call from Samuel. It was a Saturday morning. I was sitting on the couch staring at the TV, but not really watching it. When my phone rang, I picked it up, and there he was. Samuel. "Hey," he said, his voice casual, "just calling to check on Harry. How's he doing?" It froze. How was he doing? How was I doing? "He's fine," I said, my voice trembling. "Good," Samuel said. "Tell him I said hi." I hung up the phone, and the guilt hit me like a tidal wave. Samuel had no idea what had happened, no idea what his son had done, what I had allowed to happen. I thought about telling him, about confessing everything, but the thought of it terrified me. What would he say? What would he do? Would he blame me? Would he take Jameer away from me? I didn't know, and I couldn't risk it. So I kept it to myself, buried it deep inside where Noon could see it. But the weight of it was crushing. Me every day felt like a battle to keep going, to keep pretending everything was okay, but it wasn't okay, and I didn't know how to fix it. That call from Samuel, the guilt, the fear, they were just the beginning. The ripple effect of that night was far from over, and I didn't know how much longer I could keep it together. Eventually, I knew I couldn't keep avoiding the truth. I couldn't keep pretending everything was okay. So one evening, I sat down with Harry. It wasn't easy. The air between us was thick with tension, but I had to do it for him, for me, for us, Harry. I began, my voice trembling. "We need to talk." He didn't look at me, just stared at his hands, his jaw tight. But I pressed on. What happened? It can't happen again. It shouldn't have happened at all. I'm your mother and you're my son. That's a bond that can never be crossed. Do you understand? For a long moment, he didn't say anything. Then slowly he nodded. "I'm sorry," he whispered, his voice breaking. "I didn't mean to. I don't know what's wrong with me." And then he broke down. Tears streamed down his face as he confessed everything, his confusion, his anger, his loneliness. "I just wanted you to see me," he said, "to really see me." My heart shattered. I reached out, pulling him into hug, not as a woman, but as a mother. "I see you." I told him, "I've always seen you, and I love you, but we need help, Harry, both of us." He nodded, said, burying his face in my shoulder, and for the first time in a long time, I felt a glimmer of hope. This experience taught me that love can be complicated, messy, painful, but it's never too late to set boundaries, to seek help, to heal. If you're going through something similar, know that you're not alone. It's okay to ask for help. It's okay to admit that things aren't okay. And to everyone watching, thank you for listening to my story. If it resonated with you, please like, comment, and share your thoughts below. Don't forget to subscribe for more raw and honest stories. But before I go, you want to leave you with this. What would you have done if you were in my shoes? Could you have handled it differently? Or would you have made the same mistakes? Think about it and let me know in the comments. Until next time, take care of yourselves and each other.